This is the overall title I've been running with. We're talking about the Christian assembly. It's called by different names today, but I find this to be a term that is most consistent with really what it was and how they would have viewed it in the first century. It's the assembly. It's the gathering. It's the meeting of the Christians that they would have on a regular basis. And the subtitle is How We Got Worship Wrong. We got into that in some detail in the first couple of weeks when we talked about why the early church didn't have worship services and the real meaning of worship in the Bible, the temple that changed everything. Really, the temple was the theological center of understanding this terminological change away from worship and toward assembly. But eventually we restored and resurrected that worship terminology. Last week we talked about why they didn't preach sermons in church. And this week we're going to talk about worship wars and the biblical role of music in the assembly. So first off, just to recap where we've been. First off, the reason they didn't have worship services in the first century was that they didn't describe their meetings as worship. They didn't describe them as services. And this can be easily verified just by reading your New Testament. Nowhere is the assembly called a worship service in the New Testament. They saw their meetings rather as these horizontally focused gatherings where you're relating one to another in these meetings, which were often, again, house meetings. Don't think of these people meeting in some sacred building with some tall spires and colored glass windows and stained glass windows and such. They're meeting in somebody's house. They're sitting on a couch, sitting around a living room. And that's the vibe you get when you start to think about what's going on in first century gatherings. They were not viewed as formal ceremonial events. Now, who does that in a house? They were not viewed as offerings to God. They were viewed as a gathering where we build up one another. We also learned that the Bible's worship words actually refer to temple activities such as prostration. When you hear the phrase come and worship or bow down and worship, really the biblical word behind that is come and prostrate yourself before God. It also refers to sacrificing, which is another one of the primary Greek words that is translated as worship. It refers to sacrifice, actual sacrifice of an animal sacrifice, and have it burnt on an altar with the blood splattered on it. That's what these worship words refer to. They do not refer to Christian assembly activity. And then last week we discussed how preaching, even though we use that term all the time today, does not refer to an assembly activity. It was certainly done in the first century, but preaching then was preaching the gospel, evangelizing outsiders. It's proclaiming, it's announcing, like on the street corners or out in a public place where you could do that. And that's where converts were gained, and then they were assimilated into these gatherings of Christians that would take place outside of those preaching events. Rather, what did take place inside these Christian gatherings was not preaching, but rather teaching and encouraging. Those two Greek words for those words are the most commonly used, most frequently used terms in the New Testament to refer to the kinds of speaking activities that took place in church, in these assemblies in some people's homes. Okay? But tonight, episode 5 of 7, Worship Wars and the Biblical Role of Music. I've got 2 parts. The first part's going to talk about the biblical role of music in the assembly. And what I did for this is I just studied every time an assembly is discussed in the New Testament and every time music or singing or something is discussed in the New Testament and tried to figure out what is the role of music in those assemblies, right? First, we're going to talk about 3 things that I think are emphasized in Scripture as to about what the biblical role of music is. First off, assembly singing, we need to know, is actually rarely mentioned in the New Testament. In my dissertation, which was on this general topic, I studied 15 different passages in the New Testament and tried to analyze what's going on in these assemblies that are discussed in these 15 passages you see here. And if you want to ask the question of these 15 passages, does singing take place in those passages, 14 out of the 15, the answer is it's not mentioned. Now, maybe it happened, but it's not mentioned. There is one place where it is mentioned, and that's in 1 Corinthians and chapter 14, which we've mentioned several times already up to this week, and we'll look at it in specific here tonight. Other times singing is mentioned in the New Testament, finds itself there all, but it's not in assembly contexts, like they sang after the Passover meal. I think Roger mentioned this. Roger, you here tonight? He mentioned this a couple of weeks ago when they had sung a hymn. After they had the supper, the Last Supper, they went out to the Mount of Olives and they sung a hymn, something like that. Matthew 26, I think, and Mark chapter 14 is where you'll see it, them referring to the disciples singing a hymn after the Passover meal. Jesus is still with them. He has not been crucified. He has not been resurrected as of this point. Paul and Silas sing a hymn when they're in prison in Acts chapter 16. There's a prophecy of singing in Romans chapter 12 or 15 and in Hebrews chapter 2. There's a couple of prophecies in the Old Testament that the Gentiles will soon be singing the praises of God. And what it's referring to there is not so much a Christian assembly, but the idea that Gentiles will soon be incorporated into the people of God, and they will have reason to praise God because of that. James chapter 5 talks about, is any person cheerful? Let him sing praise, is what James says there. Is anyone sick? Let him call for the elders of the church. Different situations that may call for different kinds of things. I don't think James 5 is talking about an assembly activity, although it's certainly fine if everybody's joyful in a Christian assembly for you to sing praises to God. Nothing wrong with that. But this case, it's not really talking about an assembly activity. As well as in the book of Revelation, singing takes place several times where they sing a new song, singing the song of the Lamb. You may have heard those phrases before. Here's 3 different passages where that's found in the heavenly vision in Revelation. So singing is definitely a biblical activity. It's definitely something that Christians did. It is definitely also something they did in assembly, but it's really not emphasized or mentioned that much. And it could be because they just, maybe the whole idea of singing hadn't evolved where it has today in our culture, where we have radios, where we have the internet, where we have television, where we can hear music and extremely well-produced music at the flick of a button. At just turning on your cell phone, you can hear some of the finest music ever composed on the planet in history. But they couldn't do that in the first century. Maybe that's why singing wasn't that big of a deal back then. A second thing about the biblical role of music, you'll notice in the passages that talk about it, is that singing was directed to one another, like these passages you may already be thinking of. Colossians chapter 3, verse 16, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. But it's a horizontal activity. It's a one another activity when you're singing. It's not just between you and God alone, but there's communication taking place between you and the people around you. This other passage, which is similar to it in Ephesians 5:19, Paul says, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your hearts to the Lord. Same idea there. So it is a one another activity. And in 1 Corinthians 14, where it's mentioned a couple of times there, in an assembly context, Paul says that singing, just like everything else that happens in the assembly, must be done to build up one another. Must be done. That's Paul's language. We'll talk about that in episode number 7 on our final week. So that's the second thing about the biblical role of music. Just to lay that down as some foundation for where we're going from here. I want to talk about the worship wars pretty much from here on out. Now, I want to identify something different about tonight's presentation as compared with previous ones. The previous ones I really dealt, for the most part, with the entirety of the time I was here, talking about what's in the Bible on these different topics, whether it's preaching or edifying or the assembly activities, all that stuff. But tonight, when I'm talking about the Bible, I just mentioned what's in the Bible on this topic of singing. And I have summarized it as best as I could, trying to be fair to what the text actually says. But here, now I'm going to launch into an assessment of this worship war problem that has been out there for some time now. And if you're wanting to know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about worship wars, you're basically talking about the organ versus the electric guitar and the drum set. That kind of sums it up visually, what's been going on there. The worship wars really got underway around 1997. That's when you begin to notice in the literature, both in secular literature as well as in theological literature and elsewhere, something's going on in churches where there's this music explosion that has dramatically challenged the status quo. And you see this thing. Terry Mattingly, who is a religion columnist for, I think, the Associated Press for a long time, for Scripps Howard for a long time, he wrote an article on this worship wars problem in 1998. And he said this is what's going on in churches. Somebody eventually has to decide who's going to be happy with the music we have and who's going to be mad with the music we have. Older members will vote with their checkbooks and younger members will vote with their feet, which means they're going to walk to another church that's going to have the music that they like. And this was a crisis that few churches were able to avoid back in the late 90s. And it was labeled Worship Wars. And there were a couple of books that went by that title. It got to be a catchphrase to refer to the entire controversy surrounding this. What I want to do tonight is basically take this problem of modern worship music. If we put it through the worship grinder, I think, in other words, if we try to assess worship wars with the premise that what we do in our assemblies is worship, you're going to conclude that, well, worship music needs to be worshipful. It needs to be somehow pleasing to the ears of God. That's taking it through the worship grinder. But what I want to do tonight is do the same thing, but take it through the edification grinder. In other words, take this event known as worship music, that every church has it, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, Pentecostal, they all have worship music. And let's send this through a worship grinder, or rather an edification grinder. Through the New Testament perspective of music, and let's see what pops out on the end. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to try to come to answer what this question mark is at the end of the worship grinder. It's something like making sausage, which we're going to do tonight. And I should also just note that I'm processing this through my head. And my head is, as my wife will tell you, is not always on target. So I'm doing my best here, giving my guess as to if you analyzed worship music through the edification grinder, I'm going to tell you what I think. You may disagree with some of this stuff, and I respect that. And you may see some problems, and you may agree with some of the things I'm going to present here tonight. We'll have hopefully 30 minutes at the end where we can talk about that. But let's first start with some benefits of worship music as we assess it through this New Testament concept of edification. First, the lyrics of today's worship music are more intelligible. The reason I use the word intelligible is because of this verse in 1 Corinthians 14:9. Paul here is trying to assess everything that takes place in a Christian assembly. And he says this: if you utter speech that is not intelligible, how will anybody know what is said? And he's getting at this edification principle, which he mentions 7 times in this chapter, as he evaluates all the activities taking place in an assembly. So the question is modern worship music intelligible to modern people? And I'm thinking that it generally is. It's kind of like modern language Bibles. I have an NIV Bible here. NIV Bible, I think the New Testament came out in 73, the Old Testament in 78, and it made a big hit. And it started to be used in lots of churches across the theological spectrum, across the country, even across the world. It's an English language Bible, but it was very much written in modern language. The question, with English translations is we got to translate this Greek into English. The problem with translations for a long time was that the King James Bible was viewed as the translation. Yet what is magic about translating Greek into the language of Anglicans in England in the 1600s? What's magic about that? Why do Americans living in Illinois in the year 2020 need to read a Bible that was written for Anglicans 400 years ago? Well, eventually most Bible translators and church leaders realize that, yeah, you're right. It's kind of dumb to be using a Bible that is faulty, basically, in a lot of different ways. And I can go into that in great detail. I won't bore you with that. But so what we're having with music, it's kind of the same as what was going on with Scripture. If Scripture is more communicative, more intelligible, if it's communicated in modern language, so also is music. And you'll find with, I think, you're wondering, why do we sing songs that are King James Version songs that are using these and thous and couldst and wouldst and other archaic terminology that nobody uses today? Why can't we speak in modern language? Well, most of these modern language worship songs are very much in very modern English. And it just makes sense for that to be the case. I think that's a benefit of the modern idea of worship music. Secondly, I think the music style of modern worship music also communicates well to modern culture. This is all goes along with the idea of being intelligible to people, speaking people's language. Music has a language. And you can tell whether you're listening to a tune, whether that tune is from, the 1800s or whether from the 1960s, when the good stuff was produced, or if it was more recent derivation. Music, not the lyrics, but the music has a date on it. It's very much cultural and it shifts. Now, I don't know where rap music came from, but it came from something out of society and something out of culture, and it became extremely popular. But so that music changes. And it's important, I think, for church music to change so that it is intelligible and communicates to modern people. I put the church's one foundation in here. This is an old song written in the 1800s, but it has a certain rhythm, has certain harmonies. And Maureen, you'd be good at this. You've got a master's in music, don't you?
No, bachelor's.
Bachelor's, okay, close enough. Yeah, okay, that's right. Yes, thank you. But the idea here with a song like this is the harmonies in here. The chords that are used are very common from one song to another. For the longest time, I've always sung bass. Not that well, but I sing bass. And sometimes when there's any song sing, I'll sing the bass line. I don't know, maybe it's just a challenge to me. I probably really suck at it, but I just do it anyway. But one thing I noticed after I've been doing this for like 20 years, somebody made a comment that all the songs that we're accustomed to singing back in the 1980s were basically the same, had the same rhythm, same harmonies, same notes that were, and I'm hitting the same note from a G to a C or to a Q. I really don't know. I don't know enough about it to be able to identify this, but I noticed that there is such a thing as modern language music. And the rhythms and harmonies and chords today are unique to today, and they were not there so much 10 years ago, or 20, or 30. Music changes. And so just like language changes, music changes, and it's a good thing, not a bad thing, to try to, in church music, communicate to people and make the songs more intelligible so that it resonates with them. I get that. I think that's part of Paul's point in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. So a third worship music benefit is that more Christians are now involved in speaking. They're speaking through their singing. Because this is the kind of image you see in a lot of churches today. They'll have a worship team that they call, or a worship band led by a worship leader as they sing worship songs. And so we have several people up on the stage. And we talked last week about one of the problems that we've had in churches is you've got one guy who's doing all the talking. And we don't gain a benefit from what other people are thinking or what they have to say. And it's true that when people get up there and sing, they're actually singing some lyrics that are already set down for them, but at least somebody else is up there leading and saying something. Somebody else is up there, I think, gaining from the experience of being in something of a leader position. I think that's part of the way toward the idea that I saw in the New Testament of many people participating in the assembly. And when that happens, many people have the opportunity to grow and to develop their skills. One of the problems here with this arrangement is with leadership comes responsibility. I remember the first time I got in the pulpit, scared out of my wits for sure, but there's no way to stand up in a pulpit and preach to anybody else without feeling an awesome responsibility to make sure I've got my own act together. You know, that old question, who are you to preach to me? And history has been filled with the cases of pastors and ministers and priests who have engaged in activity which destroyed their reputation and actually nullified their ability their right to stand up in front of anybody and preach to anybody. So I think anybody who gets up there has a responsibility to make sure that their life reflects the stuff that they are professing out of their own mouth in front of a bunch of people, right? I think a lot of this idea comes from Titus chapter 2, when Paul said this to Titus. He said to Titus, now in all things, you show yourself to be an example of good deeds. You be a good role model so that the opponent will be put to shame, having nothing bad to say about us. I think, well, some of the people who are up there start to get involved in stuff they shouldn't be involved in. It not only destroys their own reputation, but the church itself suffers a shot at their own reputation when you allow people up there who really shouldn't be doing that. You follow me? So I think this is, what's my point here? My point is that, yes, it's good to have people participating, but I don't know if you're in one of these churches, if you've got a worship team and you're in charge of talking to those folks, are you emphasizing the importance of them being a good role model for other people? Or do they feel free to just be a rock star? Because I think this is what I hear a lot of people who want to get some stage time on these worship teams so that they can get that silver microphone in their hand and have this experience of being a rock star without the accompanying responsibility of acting like a Christian from Monday through Saturday as well, right? Anyway, I'm not trying to say that everybody who gets up there is a bad person. I'm just saying that I'm just not sure that the emphasis is there for them to follow through with their own lives. It would be great if it were. So let's talk about worship music problems. Now, I had 3 good things, benefits, I see from worship music when you put it through the edification grinder. I have 7 problems that I see, and you may or may not disagree with what I've got here. Item number 1. The modern emphasis on worship music has ended up excluding some people. Let me describe what I'm talking about here. Here's a statement from a senior pastor at a church in Minneapolis that was published in a newspaper in 1999. He was explaining why they have all this worship music, why they had gone to all contemporary music, and they had done away with traditional music. He says, some say they're not comfortable here anymore. We feel badly about it. This is where we're going, and this is who we're reaching. In other words, forget you, we don't care. You don't like our music, there's the door. There's something not Christian about that approach. I I get it. I see the marketing tactic here that can work, but there's something unchristian about this, just writing off an entire group of people who don't like the music that we've gone to. Yeah, I'm wearing hearing aids. And I've been in some of these churches and have sat right underneath the speakers. And I've also been subject to migraine headaches in the past. Oh my. There have been a couple times when sitting through church was actually physically extremely painful. And I just wanted to curl up into the fetal position in the pew and put something over my head. It's that bad. But like this guy, we feel badly about that, but this is the way we are. Okay, so you're just writing me off. I'm an old geezer. You get it. You don't have any use for me. But like, who was it said in that first slide I had? We'll vote with our checkbook. And the kids will vote with their feet. It shouldn't devolve into a battle. Something's wrong from the get-go when this stuff happens. So this is how people get excluded. Sometimes it's the older generation that gets excluded because they don't gravitate quickly enough to this modern music or the volume of it, and thus separation takes place. What happened in so many churches back in the 90s and in the early 2000s was you split the church on purpose. You split it into a morning service, an early service, and a late service. And the early service was for the geezers who like the traditional stuff, and the late service was for the young hipsters who like the new stuff, right? And it was sort of a way to keep some semblance of unity. And it really was just a semblance thereof, because really that was a church split that took place in order to split them right down the middle and say, you go over there, we're going here, and this is what we are. But few churches, if you're a small church, if your total attendance is 75, which a lot of churches were back in the 90s, you really don't have the ability. You can't afford to be splitting into two groups. You end up with like 12 in the early service and the rest of them are in the late. And then eventually with this splitting that takes place, they start to dwindle away. And I tell you, those churches, well, all churches, regardless of how they dealt with this worship music issue back in the 90s, all churches have suffered tremendously attendance-wise over the last 30 years. I dare say that according to my own church studies of church attendance patterns, half the people that were in church 30 years ago are still in there. And I'm not just talking about the people who died. We just haven't maintained the number. It's been going down and down and down. Maybe this splitting of church services that we did back in the late 90s helped. Maybe it hurt. I don't know. I don't quite know how to evaluate that. Ultimately, what happened when you had this split in churches? Devotion to music style exceeded one's devotion to one another. You may have had some commitment to your brothers and sisters in Christ before you split into two services, but ultimately you were glad to see them go so you could enjoy the music you like. There's something, again, wrong about the priorities with that whole scenario. So you're essentially excluding other people, and I don't see that as a Christian virtue. Worship music problem number 2 is the assumption that God has needs. Let me explain this. There have been times when I have spoken about this principle that worship services did not take place in the first century, that they met to edify one another. Some people have said, it's all about God and it's not about me, because if it's all about me, it ain't about much. This trite phrase has been used as a way to cut down this emphasis on one anothering in an assembly. Because if it is a worship service, and if our buildings are houses of worship, and if we gather to worship with a worship team and a worship pastor, or worship leader and worship songs, you would think that therefore we are there to worship God. Therefore, it's all about God. And if it's all about God, then why are we doing these one another songs? But what if God is saying, wait a minute, kids, it's all about you? And I think that's what I read in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. There were people who were speaking in tongues in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 without it being translated, and they were just enjoying this unique communion they had with God through speaking this special language that nobody else understood. They were forgetting about its impact on anybody else. But Paul says, stop that. No, you can't do that. If you're not going to have it translated so people understand what you're saying, you must keep silent in church. That's Paul's actual edict in 1 Corinthians 14. It is all about you. The assembly is all about us growing, us getting better, so that next week we're more patient than we were this week. Next year, we're a little more skilled at loving one another, at showing hospitality, being kind and giving and serving and generous. All those things. We should be progressing, as the writer of Hebrews said in Hebrews 5, by this time you guys ought to be teachers, but you're not. We ought to be teachers. We ought to be developing to a point where we're at a greater level of maturity, thanks to our assemblies and the way we're conducting them. And if it's all about God, then I don't know that we're really developing. But it is. God says it's all about you. That's how I see that. I ran across this statement from Donald Husted. He was a church music professor in an article in 2000 when these articles about the worship wars were flooding America's newspapers as well as magazines. He made this statement, worship is not for our enjoyment. Worship is for God's enjoyment. So how do you fight that? Huh? So what kind of music does God enjoy? I think we all know that he prefers rock and roll music. I think that's a given. But just the very idea that God is tapping his toes, tapping his feet when we're singing down here to him. Worship is for God's enjoyment. I don't know that this is a biblical concept. I don't see it certainly in the New Testament. Ultimately, this presents God as this entity that has needs. Feed me. No. Flatter me. I want more. Say it again. That's not my image of God that I get from my Bible. Paul made this statement in Acts chapter 17 as he spoke to the Athenians. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, doesn't live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything. The needy God? Paul says he doesn't need anything. And yet I think our emphasis on worship has created sort of a false theology that actually makes God into this needy God that likes to enjoy our music. This does not negate the need for us to sing and to sing praises. Don't get me wrong. Let's just make sure we got our theology right as we proceed with this. Another problem of the modern worship music is the loss of horizontal music. Now, let me explain this one as well. What has happened since the 90s when this worship music explosion took place? Vertical music became all the rage. And vertical music is actually an actual term that the people who were involved in the praise and worship explosion would use. They recognize that praise and worship music is all vertical. It's all to God. Everything we do is for God. All the songs we sing is for God. It's supposed to be praise and worship music. That's what it's called now and has been since the 90s. But whatever happened to horizontal music? Some of you know CCLI, the Christian Copyright Licensing International. Anybody who has anything to do with the songs that are sung in any church almost on the planet has a relationship with CCLI. Because they're the ones who do the licensing and handle the copyrights for all the lyrics and music of all these songs. And you got to pay CCLI for the rights to be singing. Maureen, you know all this. Anybody who's involved in this stuff knows all this stuff. But this is the top 10 songs as of October 31st of just 2 days ago. And if you look, I occasionally go on to CCLI and take a look at the top 10 songs. And as a general rule, 90% of all the songs are praise and worship music today. That would not have been true 30 years ago. Something happened there in the 90s that shifted the focus on the kinds of music that ends up at the podium in a church. They put out a top 100 of the United States at CCLI. They also keep stats on the top 10 songs at any given time. They've got all the stats for it because they've got all these churches reporting in on a constant basis. It's really quite interesting. We'll talk more about this chart a little bit later as well. To analyze this issue, I went back to a hymnal. This is just a sample hymnal. I like this one because it was produced in 1997, a key year. Because in my mind, as I've studied and researched this problem of worship music and the worship wars, that year is when the battles really began in earnest and began to build after that point. But this hymnal, and there's nothing sacred about this particular hymnal, but this one was in production in 95 and 96, and it came out in 97, almost at the wrong time. But if you look in this hymnal and go into the back, into the index, this is one thing everybody has to do if you're going to lead singing in any church. There will be an index at the back. And if you've got to have a song that matches like the scripture reading or a sermon that's about like stewardship and service, you would go to the back and you could find all the stewardship and service songs. But nobody is using hymnals anymore, or very few people are. They're using CCLI and then they're throwing the words up on the screen, right? That's true in most churches, even in Dixon, I think. There are still hymnals often in a lot of the pews, but the hymnals aren't being used and the indexes aren't being used. The horizontal songs that used to be readily available in all these hymnals back in the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, etc., had tons of horizontal music, but they're not being sung anymore. This worship music has taken over, so we can ask the question, whatever happened to horizontal music? This is just a sample of some of the headings you would see in the index of brotherhood and the church and both these horizontal topics where we're actually talking to one another in our songs and encouraging one another. Yeah, Raj?
Who published that particular hymnal? Who was the publisher?
Yeah, I heard it. I knew somebody was going to ask that, and I looked at the copyright page, and I think it was called the Celebration Hymnal.
Was it published by Zondervan?
I don't think so. I think it was Celebration something was part of the title of that. There's a lot of hymn producers out there, although they're all going broke now because nobody's buying these things anymore, right? When's the last time your church bought several hundred hymnals for thousands and thousands of dollars? When you're throwing the lyrics up on the screen, why do you do that?
I worshiped at a church in Minnesota on Sunday, and we did not have words on the screen. We didn't have a screen. We used it for a standard bulletin and a hymnal.
There you go.
There you go.
They're still out there.
They're still out there.
How many people were in that church?
Probably 130, 100.
Very good. Okay. And I should make it clear, I'm not saying that using hymnals is the answer to our problems. I don't know if it has anything to do with it. It's not a bad thing, it's not a good thing, but I'm saying that something has been lost by our overemphasis on worship music, like I put here. Here are some songs that we used to sing all the time back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I would have classified these as horizontal music. When peace like a river, seek ye first. What a fellowship, blessed be the tie. All these songs that I think most of you would recognize. But it's been a long time since I've heard any of these songs in church anymore. I think the emphasis on praise and worship music has crowded out these songs from the podium of most churches. Make sense? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you disagree with that point, and I respect that. But let's keep moving on here. I think the question I'm asking here is, how can we speak to one another in all our songs when all our songs are actually speaking directly to God? Now, it's possible to have songs address God that also speak to one another. Certainly, I think that happens a lot. But I think there's part of this worship culture also fosters the idea that when we sing, we're getting into our own little cubicle. And this is just a direct thing between me and God. and nobody else has anything else to do with it. It ought to be a horizontal event, whether it is a vertical music that you're singing or horizontal music that you're singing. But that's a question that I have. So that's worship problem number 3. Here's worship problem number 4. I'm calling it an overemphasis on sensuality. Not sure sensuality is the best term to use here, but it's close enough. This is an image. This is an image. It's perfume spreading. It's appealing to the senses. Now I recognize that any song has basically 2 elements to it. It has a melody, which is pleasing to the senses. Nothing wrong about that. But it also has lyrics, and that's where the content comes. So there's 2 elements going on there. But I think what has happened with the overemphasis, am I doing that noise? Is that coming, so that beep, beep? Well, that's outside.
It's weird. There's that door open on the window. Don't forget me.
I don't know. We'll just ignore it, won't we? Thank you. Sorry. So music does appeal to the senses, but I'm concerned that the worship music has created an overemphasis on the sensuality aspect. Professor Larry Harwood in 2002, he was interviewed about his views about what's going on in worship wars. He says that what's happening now with worship music, it now becomes singing in church becomes a frothy frenzy approaching a pep rally. That phraseology caught my attention, and I wonder if he's got a point there. There's too much emphasis on sensuality. This is an interesting statement by Richard Ostling. Ostling was a great writer for Time magazine, was also the chief religion editor for the Associated Press for years and years and years. In 2001, he signed into this particular topic. He made this statement: much of evangelical worship has degenerated into showmanship, a naked and rather successful quest for popularity in a media culture. Ostling often nails things right on the head. I thought this statement was good. The showmanship that also goes along with the emphasis on worship music, the whole worship band thing and the stuff. I just am concerned. Worship music or horizontal music, whatever kind of music, ought to build one another up. And Paul and the New Testament presents building up as a kind of thing where you're growing toward maturity. It's substantive. It's like brick upon brick. You're slowly growing and getting better week after week. But what I think with some of the emphasis on worship music today, it's pumping up rather than building up. You're like a balloon that gets inflated when you're really rocking out with that song in church. But by the time you open the car door out in the church parking lot, the air's gone out. And what happened to you? Are you any better than you were from that after that experience? Now, maybe you are. I'm just asking the question here. Does it pump up or does it build up? And maybe the real question is, how can we develop songs and singing in our church meetings that really build up and do less of just the pumping up activity? Worship music problem number 5. The appearance of the mystical trance. I'm going to tread really lightly on this point. My wife would probably prefer that I kept this out of the whole thing altogether, but it's too good to pass up. The appearance of the mystical trance. I'm talking about an image like this, and I deliberately adapted this this image so you can't tell who it is. This thing where you got to have your eyes closed and your hands have got to be raised, and you've worshipped. You've just worked yourself into this worship funk, and somehow then you have achieved true worship. Once you've worked yourself into this mystical trance. I don't remember the trance being a thing in the 60s or the 70s or in AD 60 or 50. I just don't get the impression that somehow music was supposed to get people worked up into this mystical funk. Professor Larry Harwood, as he was talking about the worship wars in 2002, he talked about the notion that worship is only truly worship when worshipers look enthusiastic. I don't know if you've ever been browbeaten by a worship leader who looks out in the congregation, sees a bunch of sad, dead faces, and nobody's smiling out there. Well, you gotta sit where we are and see how you feel. Well, they tend to think that we all ought to be enthusiastic. We all ought to be pumped up, and I get it. And probably if somebody studied everything I've ever said in a pulpit somewhere, I probably was guilty of this as well. But I just don't know. I think this whole worship music explosion has taken us in places where we really don't need to be. And this is one of them, the trance. Now, I've got a little video to share with you. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Christian comedian Tim Hawkins. He's got this short bit on hand raising. So just listen and enjoy.
And I know that each church has its own worship style, which is cool. Some people are more expressive in worship, some people more subtle, and it's all good. I go to a church that's pretty expressive in worship. It's a hand-raising church. That's what it is, right? That's what, Anybody here go to a hand-raising church? Am I here? Sweet. Who here does not go to a hand-raising church? Some of you are trying, you're like, I can't. I want to, Tim. I need to get some momentum. Totally cool. But hey, if you're not used to going to a hand-raising church, you want to go and join us, feel free to join us, but don't feel like you got to join right in, okay? Start slow. We got a lot of different hand raises that we use. We actually have names for our hand raises. So I'm going to walk you through real quick, okay, what they are, just to let you know. Say you're at my church, music is rocking. Start slow. Hands in the pockets, little elbow flap. You're fine. Very subtle. Get warmed up. Get your heart rate up. When you're warmed up, start with the first one. Ready? Carry the TV. Carry the TV. That's our first one. Very subtle. Go to big screen. Big screen, a little wider. Next one's my fish was this big. My fish was this big. If you're a liar, you go out there. That's fine. Don't worry about it. Jesus loves you. Grace. Next one's hold my baby. Hold my baby. Got dueling light bulbs. That's our next one, dueling light bulbs. We got goalpost. Everybody knows goalpost. Throwing a heartburn. A lot of people like to do heartburn. Double heartburn, right back to goalpost. What's my favorite? Mufasa. Mufasa, that's my favorite. The circle of life. Tim, can you go higher? Yes, you can. You can take one hand, go a bunch of different stuff. Pointer, hatchet, schoolroom. Release the doves, give the Lord a high five, press it out. A lot of women like to wash the window. Wash the window. And when you're comfortable there, go for the big three. Village people, Rocky, touchdown. There you go, there's your big three.
So I'm walking on a fine line here. I recognize that people who do any of the things that he just described may be very sincere in what they are doing, maybe completely, totally heartfelt, and I'm not trying to criticize or make fun of that. But I think we need to recognize, has our emphasis on worship music taken us someplace where we really don't need to be? Has it created this false sense of maybe somehow being closer to God if I can squint my eyes and raise my hands and look enthusiastic, or if I'm having bowel problems? I know exactly what that problem is. Well, maybe you get the idea. By the way, Tim Hawkins has come out with a T-shirt where you can get all these different, the elbow flap is here, the hold my baby, the Mufasa. You can get this T-shirt. You can go to timhawkins.com, I think, and if you really want to purchase a T-shirt that has all these things. Now, that was interesting. The worship music problem number 6 of 7, so we're close here, is the unending striving for hipness. Hipness. In 2001, a college student who went to the Third Presbyterian Church in Richmond, Virginia, was interviewed about going to a contemporary music church where this worship music was very hip and very loud and very prominent. He criticized the music in another church. He said that soft rock contemporary sound, it's so stuck in the middle 90s. And he's criticizing and looking down on a song that was written 6 years ago, as if it's ancient and therefore out of date. But this is what this whole thing has produced. And if you look at, what happened here? Back up. Oh, I guess I don't, maybe it's in the next one. If you look at the year that the top 10 CCLI songs were produced, all of them were produced in the last 10 years. There's this emphasis on the modern stuff, the latest stuff, the stuff that's on the radio now, the stuff that CCLI says is in your top 20. That's the stuff that you select to sing on a given Sunday. One of my good friends has been a worship leader in a church in Naperville for some time. He said one of the problems of this emphasis on hipness and always singing the latest thing is the practicing that's required. I mean, you don't know these songs. You don't know these chords with the guitar and all the other instruments you've got going with this thing. And you've got to practice a whole lot more now than you used to. Back in the day, and everybody knew all the songs you're going to sing, and the worship leader could just easily rock them out really quickly without doing any practicing. You know it, right, Maureen? You get it. This happens. Okay, the quest for hipness is a problem. And that kind of goes along with problem number 7, is that I think we're essentially living in a fad. And I chose a Rubik's Cube as a way just to, these things come and go. It's just this faddish thing that's happening. Then where's it going to go? Is there anything in this worship music craze that's everlasting, that is so solid, rock solid, that's going to stay with us for the long term? Those are questions that I have. And again, here's a look at these top 10 songs. Here's the years that they were produced. The oldest one, 2012. That's when it was written. Now, I remember we would be singing songs from the 1800s frequently. How Great Thou Art. And I don't know when that was produced, or It Is Well With My Soul. I don't remember that was produced, but it was, you know, they were really old. Now, on this point, I want to shift to Billy Sunday for a second. Some of you heard me speak on Billy Sunday back in April. Dixon has its annual Founders Day, and they asked me to speak, and I wanted to speak on Billy Sunday's revival in Dixon. This photo was actually taken in Dixon in 1905. And this was actually a men's meeting. But only men came to this thing. They also had women's meetings, but this was a men's meeting, and they packed everybody inside this tabernacle. No, this was not the Rock River Assembly Dome. This was a special tabernacle that was built about a block over this way. Yeah, where Kitzman's Lumber now is. They built this special thing for it, and you could hold 1,500 people in there. I think that's the number. Or was it 3,000? I don't know. 3,000? I forget what it was. But a lot of people they could fit in it. And there's people who would be behind here. They would have a large area for the choir. And they could seat several hundred people in the choir who would be behind where the camera is here. But all this took place in Dixon back in 1905. Billy Sunday was the Billy Graham before Billy Graham. He was wildly popular, coast to coast. He was packing them in. He was in Dixon for 6 weeks, and he attracted about 150,000 people to Dixon, to that lot right over there a block away. This is in 1905, and almost nobody has a car. They packed him in, and it's a revival. I mean, it's a serious revival. He's going back and forth on the stage, and he's letting them have it, and they're loving every minute of it. Well, music was a part of these revivals coast to coast. Homer Roadheaver was his song leader. They wouldn't have called it a worship leader back then. It was a song leader for 20 years. And Homer Roadheaver wrote a book about his experience traveling with Billy Sunday. It just came out just the year after Billy Sunday stopped and died. And Homer Roadheaver assessed the secret of the success of the music in these things. The secret was in the use of those marvelous old hymns of the church and the beautiful melodious gospel songs. That was the secret, using those marvelous old hymns. He also said this statement. He said, we usually started off with old familiar hymns that everybody could sing, and then we mixed in some of the newer gospel songs. They would do new stuff. Matter of fact, these songs, The Old Rugged Cross, that was the very latest stuff. It was produced in 1912, And Homer Rohde, I think, eventually obtained the copyright to that song. This guy, there was an article in Christianity Today or some publication just in the last year, they credited him with being the father of the modern gospel music. This guy was brilliant. I Come to the Garden Alone, produced in 1912. He introduced it into the Billy Sunday revivals, became a big hit. Since Jesus Came Into My Heart, 1915, brand new song. Now today, to us, it's ancient and old, and the modern megachurches wouldn't touch songs like this. But they were the really latest hip stuff back then. But mostly, they would use the old familiar hymns as they would do these revivals, and they were wildly popular. Essentially, what I'm saying here is we've had this worship mistake that all churches have had by calling our assemblies worship services, by focusing so much on houses of worship, orders of worship, etc. And then when we had this, people actually taking this seriously in the late 90s and had this Christian music explosion back in the 90s, it's now become a multi-billion-dollar industry, really. What you get when you put these two things together, I think, is a gross overemphasis on singing in our assemblies. Whereas in a lot of typical churches back in the 70s or 80s, you have two songs and a prayer and maybe close with a song at the end. Now you got to have a 30-minute session or maybe a 40-minute session that goes on and on with nonstop singing. Where does that come from, folks? Is that really what we're supposed to be doing? Now, I don't question at all that singing needs to be there, but have we just done overkill here a little bit? That's what I'm wondering. So let's summarize what we've said tonight. The biblical evidence, church music is rarely mentioned in the New Testament. It was directed to one another, and the goal was always the building up of one another. That's all we said. I think that's all that's basically there with regard to church music in the New Testament. But we looked at three benefits: the intelligible lyrics that come from that, the intelligible music, as well as having more participants involved up on the stage or on the podium with the music. I think these are positive things. But there's some problems. They exclude others. It creates this idea of a needy God, the loss of horizontal music that has gone away, this overemphasis on the sensuality part of singing and music, the trance and the raising hands and such, the quest for hipness, and this living in a fad. Those are the problems, I think. And you might be able to name others, but those are the ones that I'm seeing. So you can actually take any assembly activity and put it through the edification grinder and assess anything. Maybe you're upset about the announcements that take place at the beginning of the church service. Well, take those through an edification grinder. Is there some edification value to those? And if there's a little bit, how can that be maximized? Take anything else, whether it's the preaching. Is there some ways that the preaching is not maximizing edification? Is it going off in the wrong direction a bit? Take anything through the edification grinder and see what comes out. So these are that's to summarize everything we do with this. Well, let me come back to this. I want to end up with this and ask you some questions. But before I do that, let me sort of wrap this up tonight with a promotion of next week. Next week, we're going to be talking about how all this worship stuff developed in the early church, eventually developed, and how we got where we are today. I did a massive amount of research in early church literature outside the New Testament, mostly in the first 400 years. And I think you're going to be really interested to see my results when I present those next week. So don't miss next week.